exhibition hall in Los Angeles smelled of sweat and floor wax, and the particular tension that accumulates in enclosed spaces where competition has been happening for hours, where winning has happened and losing has happened, and the crowd has been trained by repetition to recognize which is which. The hall was cavernous, a converted industrial space repurposed for the occasion, its high ceiling absorbing sound the way deep water absorbs light, not eliminating it, but changing its quality, making everything slightly more distant, slightly more echo-tinged. 3 competition mats had been arranged in parallel lines across the floor. 2 were still active. The third had gone quiet 20 minutes ago. Its match concluded, its mat now bordered by a loose ring of spectators who had nowhere else to be and no reason to leave. The overhead lights were industrial, bright, even merciless. They left no flattering angles. Under them, everyone looked exactly as they were. The crowd was primarily martial arts community. Practitioners, coaches, students, the serious and the curious arranged in rough hierarchy. The senior figures near the front, the younger students standing at the edges, the genuinely curious civilians pressed against the rear walls. It was not a casual audience. These were people who could read technique, who understood what they were watching at a level that general sports spectatorship didn't reach. They had opinions. They had loyalties. They held those things in the measured, contained way of people who expressed disagreement through footwork rather than argument. Near the center of the hall, at the competition mat that still held everyone's attention, a man was warming up. He did this with complete unself-consciousness, which was itself a kind of theater. He was tall, not extraordinarily so, but tall in the way that registers immediately in a room where most bodies are calibrated for compactness and low center of gravity. His GI was tournament white, fresh despite the hours of the day, its cleanliness either genuine or maintained through effort that communicated something about him either way. His belt was black, worn to the softness that comes only from years of actual use rather than display. He moved through his warm-up sequences with the fluid precision of someone for whom these movements were no longer practice. They were vocabulary, spoken without thinking, the body's first language. His name had been announced 3 times that afternoon over the hall's scratchy PA system. Each announcement had produced a specific reaction in the room. Not applause exactly, but a shift in attention, a reorientation of bodies, a collective leaning in that communicated something the crowd itself might not have articulated. This was the person the afternoon had been building toward. He had won his division twice at national level. He had competed in Japan. He had studied under teachers whose own teachers were already legend. His record was public and long and largely uncontested. His confidence was not performed. It was structural. Near the side of the mat, his students clustered, 6 of them, young men who wore their affiliation visibly and wore it with the particular pride of people adjacent to something genuinely impressive. They spoke to each other in low voices, gesturing occasionally toward the mat, toward their teacher, toward the door, toward possibilities they were already anticipating. Something was being arranged. You could feel it in the room's temperature, not physically, but in the way attention was being distributed, in the way senior practitioners near the front were exchanging looks that communicated more than neutrality, in the way the PA system had gone quiet, as if someone had decided that announcement was no longer the appropriate register for what was coming. The side entrance to the hall opened. It was a fire door, heavy steel, the kind that announces its opening with a groan and a rush of outside air. The outside air came in, briefly, carrying street noise and afternoon light. Several heads turned. A young man entered. He was not alone. There were 2 others with him, but he moved in a way that made the others seem peripheral, not through any deliberate assertion, but through some quality of presence that was either natural or so deeply cultivated that the distinction had become meaningless. He was 24. He wore a simple dark jacket over a plain shirt, dark trousers, street shoes. He carried nothing. He looked at the mat. He looked at the man warming up on it. Then he looked around the room with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone taking inventory of space. Not threateningly, not self-consciously, simply noting what was there. Several people looked at him and looked away. The tall man on the mat did not look at him at all. Near the front, an older coach with a gray mustache tracked the young man's entry with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who had learned, over decades, to pay close attention to the things that other people didn't look at. He watched the young man find a position along the far wall. He folded his arms. He began to watch the evening very carefully. The karate champion's name was Raymond Cho. This is not a famous name now. It was a significant name then in the specific world of competitive karate in California in the mid-1960s. It was a name that carried genuine weight, attached to genuine accomplishment. He had not inherited his reputation. He had built it in the way reputations built in martial arts are always built. Through accumulated victory, through the physical and psychological work of defeating opponents who were themselves skilled, through the slow accrual of a record that made other practitioners adjust their posture slightly when his name entered a conversation. He stood 6 feet 1 inch. His reach was exceptional, not freakish, not anomalous, simply longer than most, a biomechanical advantage that his training had spent years amplifying into decisive habit. He had learned to initiate from distance that other practitioners hadn't calibrated for, to arrive before the opponent's structural defenses were fully established. Combined with the speed that genuine championship-level training produced, the reach made him a particular problem for anyone who hadn't done significant research. Most of the people in the room that afternoon had done the research. None of them were planning to volunteer. The word had circulated within 20 minutes of the young man's arrival. It moved through the room with the efficiency of information that interests people who already understand its significance, passing from one cluster to the next, arriving with slightly different inflections depending on who was transmitting it, but always carrying the same essential architecture. That Bruce Lee was in the building, that Raymond Cho had noticed, and that Raymond Cho had expressed interest in a demonstration. The word demonstration was doing a great deal of work. Cho had walked to the edge of his mat, towel around his neck, and looked across the hall toward the far wall where the young man stood. He had said something to one of his students, quietly, not broadcast, but the student had smiled in a way that broadcast it regardless. Then he had raised his voice slightly. "Enough. I've heard you're fast," he said, not shouting, projecting, in the manner of someone who had spent years projecting in large spaces, who understood how to fill a room without appearing to effort it. "Everyone's heard you're fast." The hall's ambient noise dropped a register. "Fast for demonstrations," Cho continued. His tone was pleasant, professionally pleasant, the pleasantness of someone who had learned to package challenge inside courtesy, who understood that the sharpest provocations carried the lightest surface. "Fast for film. I'm curious whether fast for demonstrations translates." He let that settle. 5 strikes. I'll show you 5 of my strikes, not full power controlled, and you tell me afterward if you can account for them. He smiled. It was a genuine smile. He was genuinely curious, in the way that genuinely excellent practitioners are sometimes curious about reputation versus reality, and he had calibrated the terms of the offer to make refusal more difficult than acceptance. 5 strikes. Controlled. A demonstration. Nothing with stakes high enough to make the refusal seem reasonable. The room was paying attention now with its full capacity. Bruce Lee stood along the far wall. He was listening with the composed attention of someone receiving information that neither surprised nor particularly troubled him. His face gave nothing. His posture gave nothing. He stood with a stillness that didn't read as passivity. It read as a form of density, as if he had gathered himself inward to a point where nothing extraneous remained. 5 strikes, someone near the journalist repeated. The number felt specific, deliberate. 5 was enough to establish a pattern. 5 was enough to demonstrate a system. 5 was enough to make a point. The crowd was already calculating odds. The calculation went quickly and in one direction. The visible evidence was all on one side. Height, reach, documented record, the particular confidence of a man standing on his own mat in front of his own students in a room that had spent an afternoon affirming his status. Against that, a younger man in street clothes, smaller by 4 inches and perhaps 25 pounds, whose reputation had traveled in circles that half the room was not certain warranted the weight they had been given. Bruce Lee looked across the hall. He looked at Cho for a measured moment, the kind of measurement that happened below conscious decision, that gathered and processed without displaying the process. 5, he said. His voice was even, not flat. There was something inhabiting it that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite coldness, something more like a temperature that existed independent of the ambient one. One of his companions leaned toward him and said something quiet. Bruce Lee listened. He nodded once, not in agreement, in acknowledgement, the way a person nods when they have already arrived at the destination being described. He straightened from the wall. He began walking toward the mat. The older coach with the gray mustache near the front tracked this walk with the kind of attention he normally reserved for the moments he wanted to remember correctly. He had been in this community for 30 years. He had seen things that confirmed what he expected and things that had revised him. He was not certain which category the next few minutes belonged to. He was certain they belonged to one of them. The crowd pressed inward. The 2 active mats had gone quiet. Those matches were over or paused, or simply no longer the point. The room had reorganized its attention around a single mat, a single question, a single young man in a dark jacket walking across worn concrete toward a champion who had already decided the evening's outcome. The evening had not yet agreed. The mat was regulation size. Under the overhead lights, it looked slightly different than it had from across the room. More present, more specific, the texture of its surface visible now. The marks of the afternoon's earlier exchanges faintly recorded in scuffs and compressed fibers. Standing at its edge, the space felt smaller and larger simultaneously. Smaller because the boundaries were defined, larger because within those boundaries everything was possible and nothing was guaranteed. Bruce Lee removed his jacket. He did this without theater, folding it once, setting it at the mat's edge, straightening. Beneath it, he wore a plain white shirt. He did not remove that. He did not roll his sleeves. He stood as he was, as if what he was wearing was not a consideration that warranted adjustment. His arms, visible now to the room, were not what the room had been imagining. They were not the arms of a large man. They were the arms of someone whose relationship with physical development had been organized around entirely different priorities than mass. Dense without being bulky, carrying a quality of coiled precision that was almost architectural, like cable bridge wire rather than load-bearing timber. Several practitioners near the front looked at those arms and then looked at each other. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in the room's interpretation. Raymond Cho stood at the opposite edge of the mat. He had removed his towel. He was in his GI, his black belt, his professional posture. He was a head taller. His reach advantage was visible from 20 feet away. His students behind him stood with the satisfied energy of people who expect to confirm something they already believe. The room was quiet now in a particular way. Not the absence of sound. There was ambient noise, the building's ventilation, the shuffle of feet, the distant sound of traffic beyond the steel walls. But beneath those sounds, the human noise had ceased. No more murmured conversation, no more comparison of perspectives. The room had entered the mode it enters when it recognizes that what is about to happen will render commentary premature. Cho assumed his stance. Tournament correct. Lead foot forward, weight distributed with the precision of thousands of repetitions. His hands came up in the practiced geometry of someone who had built his system from the ground up, who knew exactly where every piece went and why. He said, "I'll announce each one, so you can prepare." He meant this generously. It was even, in its way, an additional handicap, announcing the strikes, giving the defender the advantage of anticipation. It was also, understood, differently, a demonstration of his confidence in the strikes themselves. Speed and power sufficient that announcement changed nothing. Bruce Lee looked at him. He said nothing. His feet adjusted, so slightly that 3/4 of the room did not catch it. His weight shifted a fraction backward through his hips, not retreating, redistributing. His hands came up, not in formal guard position, but in something looser, something that looked from a distance like insufficient preparation, and from close proximity was something else entirely. A structure with no unnecessary tension in it. The way water in a container has no unnecessary tension, simply occupying the available space with complete efficiency. His eyes were on Cho's eyes. Not his hands, not his chest, his eyes. This was noticed by the older coach. He uncrossed his arms. Cho cracked his knuckles, one hand then the other. The sound was crisp and clean in the quiet room. Someone near the rear of the crowd exhaled slowly. The fabric of Cho's GI tightened slightly as his shoulders settled into the geometry of commitment. He was a man about to do something he had done thousands of times, something he had refined and tested and trusted. The familiarity was in his body, visible, a kind of kinetic confidence that preceded the action the way a runway precedes flight. One of his students behind him leaned forward. Bruce Lee blinked once slowly. The overhead lights hummed. "First strike," Cho said. He moved. He was fast. That was the first thing the room understood. Not abstractly, not as reputation, but as physical fact presenting itself in real time. Cho's first strike was a lead hand jab, announced, telegraphed, and still fast enough that 3 people near the front involuntarily flinched. It did not land. Not because Bruce Lee moved away from it, because he moved into the angle beside it, a lateral displacement so economical it barely registered as movement, the body making itself briefly unavailable and then immediately present again, the jab passing through air that had been occupied a fifth of a second ago. The contact was not a block. It was a deflection, the outer ridge of Bruce Lee's lead forearm, meeting Cho's extending arm at the precise point where applied force with minimal effort redirected the strike's vector without opposing its momentum. The physics of it were simple. The execution of it was not. Snap! Cho's arm redirected. His balance, loaded for impact, found no impact and distributed itself forward. He recovered instantly. He was good. That was not in question. Second strike. Roundhouse kick. Right leg. Loaded from the hip, the way championship karate generates maximum rotational force, the whole body participating, the leg as the delivery mechanism for a chain of connected torque. It was the more dangerous weapon, and they both knew it. Bruce Lee's response was not what anyone expected. He stepped inside it, not away, inside, past the arc's maximum velocity point, into the space between Cho's body and the kick's destructive range, where the weapon becomes irrelevant because the geometry no longer permits it. His lead hand intercepted the rising knee. Not forcefully, not with the dramatic impact of a block, simply present at the joint where the kick's power chain connected, applying just enough lateral pressure to redirect the hip, which redirected the trajectory, which made the kick's intended destination suddenly behind him. Cho's foot found air. The crowd made its first sound, a collective exhale that wasn't quite a gasp, wasn't quite speech, was the sound of people revising a calculation in real time and finding the revision surprising. Cho landed. He reset. He was breathing harder now, not from exertion, but from something else, something that happens in the nervous system when the body's trained expectations encounter repeated contradiction. Third. The third was fast, deliberately fast, faster than the first two, the professional adjustment of someone who had recognized that the speed of announcement was being used and had decided to close that gap. He moved on the word's last consonant, before the room could process that it had been said. A straight punch, rear hand, full commitment. Crack. The room heard contact, not Cho's fist on Bruce Lee's body. Something else, harder, more precise, the sound of a deflecting block applied not to the arm but to the wrist at the moment of maximum extension where force has been committed and cannot be recalled. Cho's punch arrived somewhere other than its destination. His shoulder, torqued by the redirection, absorbed the residue of its own momentum. He grunted. This was the moment the room truly shifted. Because Cho was a champion. Because Cho had fast hands. And the third strike had been his fastest, his most committed, his professional response to a situation that had already surprised him twice. And it had produced the same result as the first two, and the manner of that result was becoming visible to everyone in the room as something that was not luck, not reflex, not fortunate positioning. It was a system. Bruce Lee was reading the strikes. Not predicting, reading. The distinction was precise and important. Prediction was advance information, the guess made before the fact. Reading was something that happened in the moment of initiation, in a microsecond when intention became movement, and movement carried its structure visibly to someone trained to see it. He was seeing something in Cho's body before the strikes arrived that told him where they were going and how they were organized, and he was responding to that information rather than to the strikes themselves. Cho's students behind him had gone very still. Fourth, Cho said. His voice had changed. Not broken, controlled, professional, the voice of someone who had made a decision to escalate rather than retreat. But the pleasantness was gone. The specific register of the announcement was now honest in a way the first three had not been. He came with a combination. Lead hand feint, rear hand follow, front kick to close. A sequence designed to address the problem of someone reading single strikes by creating a chain that required the reading of sequence rather than individual movement. It was correct thinking. It was the adaptation the room had been waiting to see. The proof that he was more than a one-speed practitioner. The feint moved. The rear hand loaded. The front kick initiated from the hip. Bruce Lee's hands moved twice in the space of a single breath. The feint was ignored. Genuinely ignored, not treated as a threat, passed through without response, which meant the hand responding to it had to find something else to do or found itself overcommit. The rear hand's path was intercepted at its source rather than its destination, not at the fist, but at the shoulder, a palm placement that redirected the mechanical chain before it could complete. The front kick, without the structural support of the punch landing, arrived in a context it hadn't been designed for and found a forearm positioned at the precise angle to dissipate its energy outward rather than absorbing it centrally. Cho stumbled. Half a step. Caught himself. The room gasped. Not at the stumble, at the sequence. At the evidence, clear now to everyone with eyes to see it, that what was happening on this mat was not a fortunate defense by a smaller man surviving through luck. It was a demonstration, controlled, precise, absolutely deliberate. 5 strikes announced, and met with 5 responses that had grown progressively more complete, as if the first 4 had been data collection, and the 5th was about to be something else entirely. 5th, Cho said. He breathed in. He drove everything into it. His rear leg cross-stepped, generating rotation from the ground up, every kilogram of his weight behind the committed punch. The full expression of what a champion could deliver when he set aside restraint and gave the final word in his own language, loud and clear and undeniable. Time seemed to compress. The strike traveled its path. Bruce Lee's leading hand rose, not to meet the fist, not to oppose the force, but to intercept the elbow at the precise moment of full extension, a point where the arm's structural chain was both most committed and most vulnerable to lateral displacement. His palm made contact. His body rotated a fraction. Minimal, contained, the rotation of a hinge rather than a pivot, transferring the incoming force through his structure and into the floor rather than into his body. Snap! Cho's fist stopped. Not in the way a wall stops a punch. In the way water stops a stone dropped from height. Completely, immediately, without drama, the energy absorbed and redistributed and made harmless in a single continuous motion that Bruce Lee's body executed from his feet to his fingertips. Cho's arm was extended. His weight was forward. His face, inches from Bruce Lee's face, held an expression that no tournament had ever put there before. Then Bruce Lee's right hand, which had been nowhere in particular, which had been positioned at his side with the looseness of something not yet needed, made contact with Cho's solar plexus. Not a full strike. A touch. The weight of it was restrained. Deliberately, precisely restrained. Enough to make the statement. Enough to communicate what would have arrived if the touch had been a decision rather than a message. Breath left Cho's body. He folded. One knee, then the other. He was not unconscious. He was not badly hurt. He was reckoning. His body and his understanding simultaneously processing information that each had received and neither had fully expected, finding themselves in a conversation with a reality they had not prepared for adequately. The room was silent, absolutely silent. The overhead lights hummed. Raymond Cho stayed on his knees for a moment that lasted longer than its seconds. No one moved toward him. No one moved at all. The room had arrived at a stillness that felt structural, as if movement might break something, might disturb an atmosphere that was still settling, still reaching its final form. People stood where they had been standing and did not readjust, did not whisper, did not look at the person beside them to confirm what they had seen. They had seen what they had seen. Cho's hands found the mat. He processed through his palms, the texture of the surface, its temperature, the simple fact of its presence beneath him. This was what his body had found to hold on to, while his mind completed a revision it had not anticipated needing. 5 strikes announced. 5 strikes blocked. He had announced them to give the defender the advantage of preparation, which had made the outcome more impossible by conventional measurement, not less. Every element he had understood as advantage. His announcement, his experience, the quality of his strikes, the final commitment of the 5th, had been answered with something that occupied the space between technique and instinct so completely that the distinction had become meaningless. He had not been humiliated. That was the thing he would understand later, when the immediate reckoning had completed itself and he could think in full sentences again. He had not been made small. He had been made accurate, given a precise picture of where his understanding ended and someone else's began, which was something teachers spent their entire careers attempting to provide to students and almost never succeeded. He was receiving it from a man in street clothes on a mat he had believed was his. One of his students, the one who had smiled earlier, the one whose smile had communicated certainty, was looking at the floor. Not ashamed, recalibrating. The smile was not available right now because the certainty that produced it was under renovation. Near the front, the older coach with the gray mustache had not moved from his position. He was still watching. He was watching Bruce Lee, who stood at the center of the mat with his hands at his sides, his breathing indistinguishable from the breathing he had entered the room with, measured, quiet, the respiration of someone at rest. He had not stepped back to provide distance. He had not stepped forward to stand over Cho. He simply stood where the exchange had ended, in the geometry it had produced, without adjusting that geometry for the purposes of how it would be perceived. Someone near the wall, one of the practitioners from the adjacent mat's audience, said very quietly to the person beside them, "Did he?" and stopped. The person beside them nodded. Near the steel door through which they had entered, one of Bruce Lee's companions stood with his arms crossed and his face carefully neutral. Not victorious, carefully neutral, in the way of someone practicing the expression their companion would want reflected back at the room. Cho raised his head. He looked at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee looked back at him with the same steady, attentive calm he had maintained throughout, the quality that several witnesses would later describe with different words but the same essential meaning. That he had been fully present for all of it, that nothing had surprised him, that he had given the exchange his complete and serious attention without giving it more than it required. "You didn't block them," Cho said. His voice was even. He was already reconstructing, already taking the experience apart to understand it, already asking the right question. Bruce Lee considered the distinction. "No," he said. "You redirected them." Yes. Cho absorbed this. He stood slowly. He stood with his full height restored, with the structural dignity of a man who had fallen and knew how to rise without theater. He looked at his own hands as if they were someone else's, instruments he had trusted completely and that had performed exactly as trained, against someone whose training had addressed something as hadn't. There's a difference, Cho said, not asking, naming it. There's a large difference, Bruce Lee said. The room heard this. The room was still quiet enough to hear everything. Bruce Lee turned. He walked to the mat's edge where his jacket was folded. He picked it up. He put it on with the same economy applied to removing it. He settled the collar. He looked at the mat once. Not at Cho, at the mat itself, the worn surface that had held the afternoon's information. A wall receives the force, he said to the room, to no one, to the conversation the 5 strikes had been part of. Water accepts it and is unchanged. He turned toward the side door. He walked. The door opened. The street noise entered briefly. The afternoon light came in at a low angle and made the concrete floor visible differently for one moment. Its texture, its accumulated history, the records of years pressed into its surface. The door closed. The room stood with what remained. The story was first told that evening at dinner by 3 separate practitioners who had been present and who each told it to someone who had not been there and who would tell it to someone else before the week was out. Each telling preserved the essential architecture and ornamented the periphery. The 5 strikes stayed 5. The results stayed consistent. The character of what happened between the 4th and 5th strikes was described differently by different witnesses. Some said they had seen Bruce Lee smile, though those who had been closer said this was impossible, that his face had held throughout the same quality of serious, focused calm. Some said words were exchanged that no one else heard. Some described the final touch, the contained, deliberate placement of the right hand that ended the 5th exchange, as something between a punch and an open palm, a gesture that meant more than it conveyed physically and conveyed enough. What no one disputed was the counting. 5. The number had been announced by the challenger himself, given as a framework, offered as a structure within which the defense would either hold or fail. The number was chose, and so the verdict of 5 for 5 was delivered in his own currency, which made it more complete than any external judgment could have been. Raymond Cho returned to his school the following week. He did not discuss what had happened, not immediately, not in the way of someone concealing it, but in the way of someone who had received information too significant to process quickly, who needed time to understand what had been demonstrated before he could responsibly transmit it. When he did eventually speak about it, he spoke precisely, without embellishment, in the manner of someone who understood that the truth of what had happened was more useful than any version of it that made him seem less than he had been. He said, "I hit exactly where I aimed every time." He wasn't there when I arrived. He changed 2 things in his curriculum within a year. Both changes were structural. One in how his students were taught to read initiating movement, one in how they were taught to think about force direction versus force opposition. He never publicly attributed the changes to the afternoon on Nathan Road, but his senior students who had been present understood. In the broader community, the story moved through channels appropriate to its content. Among competitors, it was told as a technical story, an account of reading ability, of response architecture, of the gap between speed as a quantity and timing as a quality. Among teachers, it became a different story about what decades of serious study could produce that tournament victory could not fully measure. Among younger practitioners just entering the world that had generated both men, it became something more essential and less precise. The story of 5 strikes and an answer, of a challenge made with confidence and met with something that confidence had not prepared for. Bruce Lee never told it. This was noted. The telling belonged to the witnesses, and the witnesses understood, without being instructed, that adding his account would have changed its nature. The story's power was precisely in the absence of his narration, in the fact that the event had occurred, been witnessed, and been left without interpretation by the person at its center, who had walked out a side door and returned to his evening and left everyone else to understand it as best they could. What they understood over time was this: that the karate champion had done everything correctly. He had announced his strikes. He had given the advantage to the defense. He had escalated from controlled to committed when the situation required. He had adapted. He had brought his full capability to the fifth exchange, the best version of everything he had built, everything he had earned. And it had arrived at a man who was already not there, not through evasion, through presence of a different order, the presence of someone who had emptied himself of everything that fighting usually contains that isn't fighting, who had removed the ego and the performance and the narrative and the expectation, and what remained when all of that was gone was something that moved through competition the way water moves through an open hand, touching everything, held by nothing, taking the shape of whatever encountered and leaving unchanged. 5 strikes, 5 answers. Not because Bruce Lee was faster, though he was faster. Not because he was stronger, though his precision made strength irrelevant. Because he had understood something about the nature of force that the challenger had not yet understood. That force opposed becomes force doubled, and force accepted becomes force dissolved, and that the practitioner who has fully grasped the second truth has access to a range of response that the first truth simply does not permit. You cannot block that which you have already become part of. You cannot strike that which has already moved with you. The wall breaks. The water remains. This was not philosophy. It was what happened on a mat in Los Angeles on an afternoon in the mid-1960s, witnessed by a room full of people who spent the rest of their lives measuring what they saw against what they thought they understood and finding the measurement instructive. The most dangerous thing in any room is the thing you cannot see coming because it does not announce itself, does not perform its intention, does not give you the friction of opposition to push against. It simply arrives, and then it is already gone.